Imagine you've just escaped hell. You've walked hundreds of miles through darkness, hidden in swamps, gone days without food, crossed rivers you didn't know how to swim. Every sound could be a slave catcher. Every stranger could turn you in. But you made it and you're free. Now imagine choosing to go back. Not once, but 13 times. That's what Harriet Tubman did. And the question that haunts anyone who learns a story is this: what kind of person walks back into their nightmare by choice? In 1849, Harriet Tubman was a slave in Maryland. By 1850, she was free in Philadelphia. She could have lived quietly, built a new life, stayed safe. Instead, she became the most wanted fugitive in America, with a bounty of $40,000 on her head. That's the equivalent of $1.3 million today. For one woman, because she kept coming back. 13 missions into slave territory and 70 people freed. And here's what makes it even more remarkable: she never lost a single person. Not one, but this isn't a story about a superhero. This is a story about a woman who suffered from debilitating seizures, who stood barely 5 feet tall, who had every reason to stay hidden and safe. This is a story about what it costs to choose other people's freedom over your own security. What would you have done? If you'd tasted freedom after a lifetime of bondage, could you walk back into danger? Could you risk everything you'd gained for people you didn't even know? Could you live with a price on your head, knowing that capture meant torture and death? Harriet Tubman faced these questions every single time she returned south, and her answers changed American history. This is the story of what really happened to Harriet Tubman. Not the legend, not the simplified version you learned in school. This is the story of the choices she made, the risks she calculated, the people she saved, and what it cost her to become the person we remember. Because here's what most people don't understand: Harriet Tubman wasn't born brave. She was born into slavery. She was beaten, abused, suffered a traumatic head injury that would plague her for life. She had every reason to be broken. But somewhere along the way, she made a decision that changed everything. And that decision began on a single night in 1849, when she realized that freedom wasn't something you wait for. It was something you take. Her name wasn't always Harriet Tubman. She was born Araminta Ross around 1822 on a plantation in Dorchester County, Maryland. They called her Minty. She was one of 9 children born to Harriet Ritt Green and Ben Ross, both enslaved. And from the moment she could walk, her life belonged to someone else. Childhood, for Minty, wasn't childhood as most of us understand it. By age 5, she was hired out to different families, rented like equipment. One woman hired her to check muskrat traps in icy rivers. When Minty got sick from the cold water, she was sent back as defective and given to another household. There, she was beaten regularly. Once, she tried to take a sugar cube from a bowl, just one, and the mistress whipped her so badly that she carried the scars for the rest of her life. She was 6 years old. But Minty learned something crucial during those years. She learned to endure. She also learned to resist in small ways. When enslavers tried to break her spirit, she refused to break. When they demanded submission, she found quiet ways to say no. It wasn't dramatic rebellion. It was survival with dignity intact. Then came the injury that would define the rest of her life. At 13, Minty was working in a dry goods store when an enslaved man tried to escape. The overseer demanded she help restrain him. She refused. In his rage, the overseer threw a 2-pound metal weight at the fleeing man. It missed. It hit Minty in the head instead. The skull fracture nearly killed her. For weeks, she drifted in and out of consciousness. Her enslaver tried to sell her damaged goods, but no one would buy her. She'd suddenly fall asleep without warning, sometimes in the middle of sentences. Seizures plagued her. Severe headaches became constant companions. Most people would see this injury as the end of any hope for a normal life. Harriet saw it differently. Years later, she would describe the visions and dreams that came with her seizures. Vivid, intense experiences she believed were messages from God. Whether medical or spiritual, these experiences gave her something powerful, an unshakable sense of purpose. By her 20s, Minty had taken her mother's name, Harriet. She'd married John Tubman, a free black man. Marriage didn't make her free, but it gave her a glimpse of what freedom might look like. She worked timber jobs alongside her father, learning the forests and marshes of Maryland's eastern shore. She learned to read the North Star. She learned which plants you could eat, which waters you could drink, how to move silently through woods. She was preparing, though she might not have known it yet. Harriet believed in family. She believed in loyalty. She believed that one day, somehow, she and her family would be free together. That was the dream, not to escape alone, but to build a free life with the people she loved. But in 1849, that dream shattered. Harriet learned that she and her brothers were about to be sold south, deeper into slave territory, to the brutal cotton plantations where life expectancy was measured in years, not decades. This was a death sentence disguised as a sale. She approached her husband John, hoping he'd flee north with her. He refused. He told her she was foolish. He threatened to report her if she tried. This was the moment everything changed. The moment Harriet realized that freedom wasn't something she could wait for permission to have. The moment she understood that the life she'd imagined, safe, together, free with her loved ones, might never come. She had a choice to make: stay and be sold into a living hell, or run, alone, into the unknown. Most people in her position would have stayed. The odds of successful escape were terrible. The punishment for trying was torture, sometimes death. The route north was hundreds of miles through hostile territory. She had no map, no money, no contacts. She had seizures that could strike at any moment, leaving her unconscious and vulnerable. She had every rational reason to stay. But Harriet Tubman wasn't interested in rational reasons anymore. One night in September 1849, she made her decision. She tried one last time to convince her brothers to come with her. They started the journey together, but fear overtook them and they turned back. They begged her to return with them. She refused. And so Harriet walked into the night alone. She followed the North Star. She waded through rivers to throw off tracking dogs. She hid in safe houses along the Underground Railroad, a network of abolitionists, free blacks, and sympathetic whites who risked everything to help fugitives escape. She walked nearly 90 miles. And when she finally crossed into Pennsylvania, into free territory, she later described the feeling: "I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven." But then came the loneliness. "I was free," she said, "but there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land." She had her freedom, but her family was still enslaved. Her friends were still in bondage. And Harriet realized something that would define the rest of her life. Freedom doesn't mean anything if you're the only one who has it. That realization, that uncomfortable, dangerous realization, is where her story really begins. Harriet Tubman settled in Philadelphia in late 1849. She found work as a domestic servant, saved her money, built a quiet life. She could have disappeared into that life. She could have been safe, but safety felt like betrayal. Her family was still enslaved in Maryland. Her niece Keziah and Keziah's 2 children were about to be sold at auction, and Harriet couldn't stop thinking about them. She couldn't stop seeing their faces. She couldn't stop imagining what would happen if they were sold south. So in 1850, barely a year after her own escape, Harriet made a decision that defied all logic. She would go back. Think about what this meant. The Fugitive Slave Act had just passed, making it legal for slave catchers to operate in free states. Any black person, free or enslaved, could be kidnapped and dragged south. The entire country had become dangerous for her, and she was going to walk back into Maryland, back into slave territory, back into the place she'd nearly died escaping. Why? When asked later, Harriet's answer was simple: "I couldn't leave them." That's it, not a grand political statement. Not a calculated strategy, just, "I couldn't leave them." But going back required more than courage. It required planning, intelligence, and a willingness to become someone she'd never been before, a leader. Harriet connected with William Still in Philadelphia, a black abolitionist who coordinated Underground Railroad activities. She studied routes, memorized safe houses, learned the patterns of slave patrols. She saved every dollar she earned. And in December 1850, she returned to Maryland. Her first mission was to rescue her niece Keziah. Working with Keziah's free husband, Harriet orchestrated a daring plan. At the auction, Keziah's husband placed the winning bid, then delayed payment. In that window of confusion, Harriet spirited Keziah and her children away before anyone realized what had happened. They traveled by night, hidden in wagons, moving from safe house to safe house. Every sound could be a slave catcher. Every delay could mean capture. But they made it to Philadelphia. Harriet had proven something crucial. It could be done. Most people who accomplish something remarkable once stop there. They count themselves lucky and move on. Harriet went back. In spring 1851, she returned to Maryland again, this time for her brother Moses and 2 other men. Then in fall 1851, she went back for a group of 11 fugitives, her largest group yet. She developed a system, a set of rules that kept people alive. Start on Saturday nights. Runaway notices couldn't be printed in newspapers until Monday, giving them a head start. Trust no one completely, even sympathetic people could be compromised. Never turn back. Once you started north, you kept going. Doubt was contagious and deadly. Carry a gun. Not primarily for slave catchers, though she'd use it if necessary, but for her own passengers. If someone panicked and wanted to return, endangering everyone, Harriet would point the gun at them and say, "You'll be free or die a slave." Fear of her became stronger than fear of the journey. This might sound harsh, but Harriet understood something critical. One person's panic could get everyone killed. One person talking under interrogation could destroy the entire network. The stakes were absolute, and she never lost anyone. But each mission extracted a cost. Harriet's seizures worsened with stress. She'd be leading people through a forest and suddenly collapse, unconscious, her passengers terrified and exposed. She learned to feel them coming, to hide before they struck. But they reminded her constantly. She was vulnerable. Her body could betray her at any moment. The physical toll was matched by the emotional weight. Every mission meant choosing which family members to prioritize. She couldn't save everyone at once. Each trip meant leaving people behind, knowing they might be sold before she could return. In 1851, she tried to convince her husband John to come north. He'd remarried. He had a new life. He told her to leave and never come back. That rejection cut deeper than almost anything else. But Harriet absorbed it and kept going. By 1852, Harriet had become known among enslaved people in Maryland as Moses, the one who leads people out of bondage. Enslavers knew someone was orchestrating escapes, but they didn't know who. They suspected a network of white abolitionists. They couldn't imagine it was one black woman with seizures. That invisibility was her advantage. But it couldn't last forever. In 1856, enslavers in Maryland realized what was happening. Notices appeared in newspapers offering rewards for the capture of the person helping slaves escape. The amounts climbed $5, $000, $12, $000, eventually reaching $40,000. $40,000 in 1850s currency. For one woman. To put that in perspective, that's over $1.3 million today. For a single fugitive slave. It was an astronomical sum, revealing both the economic damage she was causing and the fury of the people she was defying. Harriet knew about the bounty. She knew that every person she encountered, black or white, enslaver or free, could be tempted by that amount. She knew that her mere existence was worth a fortune to the right person. And she kept going back. This is where the story stops making logical sense and becomes something else. This is where calculation gives way to conviction. Because no rational risk assessment would support what Harriet continued doing. But Harriet wasn't operating on rationality alone. She was operating on something she believed was stronger: divine purpose. She described her escapes in spiritual terms. She had visions before missions, dreams that showed her routes and dangers. Whether you interpret this as intuition, divine guidance, or the heightened awareness that comes from extreme stress doesn't matter. What matters is that it gave her certainty in situations where most people would be paralyzed by doubt. In 1857, she made one of her most daring rescues, bringing her elderly parents north. Her father, Ben Ross, had been freed, but her mother Rit was still enslaved and elderly. Moving elderly people was exponentially harder. They couldn't travel fast, couldn't hide easily, required more rest. Harriet didn't care about the difficulty. These were her parents. She disguised them, put them in a wagon, and moved them through the Underground Railroad network. At one point, she built a crude wheeled vehicle to transport them when walking became impossible. She navigated checkpoints, evaded patrols, and brought them safely to Canada. where the Fugitive Slave Act had no power. Imagine the emotional weight of that journey. These were the people who had brought her into the world, who had watched her be beaten and hired out and injured. Now she was leading them to freedom, reversing the natural order, becoming the parent to her parents. That rescue alone would have been enough for a legacy. Harriet was just getting started. By the late 1850s, Harriet had refined the Underground Railroad into something resembling a military operation. She knew every safe house from Maryland to Canada. She knew which rivers could be forded where, which towns were dangerous, which abolitionists could be trusted absolutely. She traveled with disguises, sometimes dressed as a man, sometimes as an elderly woman, once as a chicken seller to avoid suspicion. She learned to read her environment with extraordinary precision. If dogs barked differently, she'd change routes. If she sensed something wrong, she'd trust that instinct over any plan. Her passengers came to trust her absolutely. When Harriet said move, you moved. When she said hide, you disappeared. When she said it was safe, you believed her. And you believed her because she'd proven, over and over, that she could be trusted with your life. But the work was taking its toll. Harriet barely slept during missions. She lived on adrenaline and conviction. Between missions, she worked constantly to earn money for the next rescue, because these operations cost money, food, bribes, transportation, supplies. Harriet funded much of it herself through domestic work, speaking at abolitionist meetings, and donations from supporters who were starting to recognize her work. She became known in abolitionist circles. Frederick Douglass, the famous formerly enslaved writer and speaker, knew her and admired her. He later wrote, "I have had the applause of the crowd, but the midnight sky and the silent stars have been the witnesses of your devotion to freedom." John Brown, the radical abolitionist who would later raid Harper's Ferry, called her General Tubman and consulted with her about resistance strategies. But fame brought danger. The more people knew about her, the more recognizable she became. The more recognizable she became, the more valuable that $40,000 bounty looked. Harriet adapted. She moved her base of operations to Canada, beyond the reach of the Fugitive Slave Act. She changed her patterns, varied her routes, never became predictable. And through it all, she kept going back. In 1860, she made her 13th and final mission to rescue enslaved people. Why stop at 13? Not from fear, not from exhaustion, but because by 1860, the political situation was changing. Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Southern states were threatening secession. War was coming. And Harriet recognized that the time for secret rescues was ending. The time for open conflict was beginning. Let's talk about what these 13 missions actually cost Harriet Tubman. Physically, the seizures worsened. The headaches became chronic. She aged rapidly from stress and malnutrition. She would suffer these symptoms for the rest of her life, a permanent legacy of the weight she carried and the injury she sustained. Financially, she owned almost nothing. Every dollar went to missions or survival. While other free blacks were building businesses and buying property, Harriet was funding escapes. Personally, she had no stable home, no family life of her own, no rest. She lived in constant danger. Her marriage had ended. Many of her relatives made it north, but the years of separation left wounds. Psychologically, she carried the weight of 70 lives. 70 people who would have died enslaved if not for her. But also, hundreds she couldn't reach. Every person she left behind haunted her. And yet, when asked late in her life if she regretted any of it, Harriet's answer was immediate and clear. No, I never ran my train off the track and I never lost a passenger. This is what pride looks like when it's earned. This is what satisfaction looks like when it's built on genuine sacrifice. But here's what often gets lost in the legend. Harriet Tubman wasn't superhuman. She was terrified on many of those missions. She felt despair when people wouldn't come with her. She felt anger at the institution that made this necessary. She felt doubt. She just kept moving anyway. That's not superhuman, that's something more impressive. That's a regular human choosing to be extraordinary through sheer force of will and conviction. And when the Civil War began in 1861, Harriet didn't rest, she couldn't. Because freedom for 70 people wasn't enough when millions remained enslaved. So she joined the Union Army. Most stories of heroism end with the great achievement, the rescue, the victory, the moment of triumph. Harriet Tubman's story is different because her fight didn't end with those 13 missions that IT evolved. When the Civil War broke out, Harriet could have retired to Canada, could have lived quietly as an elder statesperson of the abolitionist movement. She was nearly 40 years old, her body damaged by years of brutal work, her health fragile. Instead, she volunteered for the Union Army. She served as a nurse, treating wounded soldiers black and white. She served as a scout, using her knowledge of southern terrain and her network of contacts to gather intelligence. And then she did something that had never been done before. In June 1863, Harriet Tubman led an armed raid. The Combahee River Raid in South Carolina was a military operation to free enslaved people and disrupt Confederate supply lines. Harriet guided Union gunboats up the river, identified locations where enslaved people were held, and orchestrated their liberation. 750 people were freed in a single night. Think about that. In 13 missions along the Underground Railroad, she'd freed 70 people. In one military operation, she freed 750. It was her skills, her intelligence, her credibility with enslaved communities that made it possible. She became the first woman to lead an armed military operation in American history. And she did it for no pay. The Union Army promised her wages but never delivered them. She survived by selling pies and root beer to soldiers. After the war, Harriet faced a new struggle, being forgotten. The country moved on, Reconstruction began and failed. The men who'd led the war became celebrated. The woman who'd risked everything got nothing. She applied for a military pension and was denied. She applied for recognition and was ignored. She settled in Auburn, New York, where she'd bought land before the war. She took in elderly formerly enslaved people who had nowhere to go, running an informal care home. She remarried to a man named Nelson Davis, a Civil War veteran, and finally had some semblance of family life. But money was always scarce, recognition was always absent. It wasn't until 1899, after decades of advocacy by supporters, that Harriet finally received a pension, but only as a widow of a veteran, not for her own service. She lived to be about 91 years old, dying in 1913. Near the end, surrounded by friends, she said, "I go to prepare a place for you." Even in death, she was thinking about others. What her story teaches us. Harriet Tubman's story asks uncomfortable questions. What are you willing to risk for others? Not for family, not for people you know, but for strangers. For people who can never repay you. For people who might not even survive to remember your name. What does courage actually look like? It's not the absence of fear. Harriet was terrified on many of those missions. Courage is moving forward despite fear, despite seizures, despite impossible odds, because staying still feels worse than risking everything. How do you measure a life well lived? Harriet died poor, relatively unknown, without wealth or traditional success. But she freed 70 people directly and hundreds more indirectly. She changed the course of history. Does that count for more than comfort and security? What is freedom worth? To Harriet, freedom wasn't just personal liberation. It was a moral obligation. She couldn't enjoy her own freedom while others remained enslaved. That conviction drove her back into danger 13 times. And perhaps most importantly, what happens when one person refuses to accept injustice? Harriet Tubman didn't end slavery. She didn't win the Civil War. She didn't transform America's racial consciousness. But she freed 70 people who would have died enslaved. She proved that resistance was possible. She inspired thousands. She demonstrated that one person, with nothing but conviction and courage, can make an impossible difference. There's a phrase Harriet often used during those Underground Railroad missions. When passengers grew frightened, when they wanted to turn back, when the journey seemed too hard, she would tell them, "If you hear the dogs, keep going. If you see the torches in the woods, keep going. If there's shouting after you, keep going. Don't ever stop. Keep going. If you want a taste of freedom, keep going." That advice wasn't just for fugitive slaves. It's advice for anyone facing something that feels impossible. Anyone who wants to quit. Anyone who's chosen something meaningful but difficult. Keep going. Harriet Tubman's life was defined by one choice, made over and over, to keep going when stopping would have been easier, safer, more rational. She kept going when her husband rejected her. She kept going when she had seizures in the middle of escape routes. She kept going when there was a $40,000 bounty on her head. She kept going through the Civil War. She kept going through poverty and obscurity after the war. She kept going until she physically couldn't anymore. And because she kept going, 70 people experienced freedom who wouldn't have otherwise. Hundreds more were liberated in that Combahee River raid. Thousands were inspired to resist. Millions today know her name and draw strength from her example. That's what one person can do. Not a superhero, not someone born extraordinary. A woman who had every reason to stay hidden and safe, who chose instead to walk back into danger because freedom isn't freedom if you're the only one who has it. What would you have done? Harriet Tubman's story isn't just history. It's a question posed to everyone who hears it. When you find safety after struggle, do you stay there? Or do you go back for those still suffering? When you have every reason to stop, every justification to rest, do you listen to those reasons? Or do you keep going? When the cost of doing the right thing is impossibly high, do you calculate your way out of it? Or do you pay the price? Harriet Tubman answered those questions with her life. 13 missions, 70 people freed. 0 losses, but more than that, she answered a question that echoes through every generation. What does it mean to be truly free? For Harriet, freedom wasn't just personal. It was communal. It was moral. It was something that only had meaning if it was shared. And that conviction, that uncomfortable, demanding, revolutionary conviction, is what separates people who live comfortably from people who change the world. You don't have to rescue people from slavery to apply Harriet Tubman's lessons. You just have to ask yourself, what am I willing to risk for something bigger than my own comfort? Who am I willing to go back for? What keeps me going when stopping would be so much easier? These aren't abstract questions. They're daily choices. And Harriet Tubman's life demonstrates that how we answer those questions defines not just our own lives, but the lives of everyone our choices touch. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? And more importantly, has there been a moment in your life when you had to choose between safety and doing what was right? What did you learn from that choice? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. If this story moved you, if it challenged you, if it made you think differently about courage and sacrifice, please hit that like button and subscribe. We release new stories about people who chose the harder path every week. Turn on notifications so you never miss one. Thank you for spending this time with Harriet Tubman's story. Thank you for caring about the people who came before us and fought for the freedoms we sometimes take for granted. And if you're facing your own difficult choice right now, remember what Harriet told those fugitives in the darkness. Keep going, Al.